So thank you very much for coming to Professor Huang. Is most sought after voice in Chinese economy and U.S. China relation, and is when Isaac is really very successful investment. When Isaac was in Pomo invest $1 billion in Chinese market. Welcome. We all know that China's economy right now faces tremendous challenge. The lower domestic demand and the falling housing market, the lower birth rate and slower growth, you name it, which is daunting challenge. Like back in last August, there are some things someone said, China economy is going to collapse, but it's not collapse, but collapse, but so much more challenge. But when respond to this challenge, especially the challenge is different from past, but it seems that China still use the investment export-driven approach, especially President Xi have this new productive force to invest dramatically to semiconductor, artificial intelligence, and biomanufacturing. So it seems very kind of have very high expectation for this industrial policy. According to Economist magazine, that the investment in these sectors is about $1.6 trillion. Is a fifth of all investment in China, and it's account for 43% of all business investment in America in China. So with this strategy, China aims to lead the new industrial revolution. So, Professor, do you think this policy will have a chance to be successful?
So there's a long-term story, there's a short-term story.
Yes.
If you think about R&D investments, not just in China, but in the U.S., in other countries, the R&D investments are fundamentally costs. Right? So you incur these costs, and then you may or may not come up with technologies and scientific breakthroughs that may produce economic returns in the future. And traditionally, there's a very long time lag between the time that you make investments in technology, right? Think about drug discovery. Mm-hmm. The average time for a drug to go from sort of the beginning of the drug development to all the way to the FDA approval, clinical trials and all of that, easily 10 years. So it is, let me just put it this way, this is not a typical response to short-term economic issues, right? So maybe, well, he's Xi Jinping, he knows these things far better than people like myself. And so, I mean, I wouldn't recommend that particular way of dealing with the current situation. The geopolitics, yeah, people say because of geopolitics, because of the export controls by the U.S. Well, again, just as a professor, I would argue then you repair the relationship, right? And then you repair the relationship, and then try to get back to globalization agenda, as opposed to making investments of $1.7 trillion.
Yes.
Let me just put that number in some sort of a context. That's equivalent to the size of the GDP of Guangdong province, mm-hmm. right? The one of the most powerful economic powerhouses in China. You are investing the equivalent of Guangdong province in R&D that may or may not produce economic payoff. Mm-hmm. So that's my view.
Yeah, because when ChatGPT come out, it's really caused the Chinese artificial intelligence industry off guard. It was, oh my gosh, we invest so much spend so much money. We didn't come of China, but we do have some successful industry, like China's EV industry is really benefit from this policy. So as an investor, a foreign investor, how did you see this kind of industrial policy?
I agree with the professor. It's certainly not orthodox by any means.
Yeah.
And there's been two examples in the last 5 years where China, using the American vernacular, has thrown the kitchen sink and has failed to develop what they wanted. One was a COVID vaccine.
Yeah.
No matter how hard you tried, it didn't work. And the other one was the attempt to accelerate the semiconductor industry of China. So both those examples would say that what's being attempted is hard, perhaps really, really hard, but it fits into what the current leadership wants to do and take China. So they're not taking any of the conventional approaches that other countries took during COVID. We, in America, fiscally stimulated like crazy, to the point that we created 2.3 trillion of excess savings, which are now down to about 200 billion. And hence we have inflation. China doesn't. But I think it's almost a bridge too far, in my opinion, looking at what occurred with COVID and what's occurred with semiconductors.
Yeah. But the thing that Americans also do that, United States through the Inflation Reduction Act invest about $282 billion in clean energy, and the Chips and Science Act invests $280 billion in semiconductor industry. Americans also doing this, right?
I think it's doing it, though, from a very different economic model, because America is 67% consumption driven.
Yes.
And we don't have the under 24 unemployment issue that China has. So there's vast differences. The amounts that are being put in, just to scale it, if you really wanted to be sincere about alternative energy, it shouldn't be $1 trillion, it should be $4 trillion.
Yeah, so I very much agree with that. In many ways, the two countries face opposite challenges and opposite problems, and therefore they should adopt policy responses that correspond with the nature of the problems that they face. In China, it's a lack of demand.
Yes.
Right? In U.S., you could make an argument, a possible argument, that it is the lack of supply, given the geopolitics and also the COVID shocks that have undermined the confidence in the global supply chain. So I'm not saying that everything that U.S. has done is right economically speaking, but the nature of the problem at least matches with the nature of the policy response. And the U.S., and I argue that you talk about EVs coming out of China, solars coming out of China. That's not, so let's be very clear. A product is not an economy. The fact that you are successful in EVs, you're successful in solars, doesn't mean that you're solving macroeconomic problems. So the alternative energy, sustainable energy segment of the Chinese economy ranges between 3.5 to 7% of the GDP. Right? So you can go all the way, very successful, and now it is very much in doubt because U.S. and European unions are thinking about imposing tariffs.
Yeah.
Even in the best case scenario, we're talking about 7% of the GDP. And also, let's also remember, the new industries, the new technologies have two effects. In the short run, they actually also destroy industries, right? If I buy an EV, I'm not going to buy a gasoline-driven car. China has a massive gasoline-driven car industry.
Yes.
And that industry has a very long supply chain, has incredible employment. You know, for global climate, I argue, yes, we should make that transition. But this is why Schumpeter famously argued technology is creative destruction. Right?
Yeah.
You create and you also destroy.
Double sword war.
It's a
right?
double sword
Yeah.
war. So in the short run, you know, essentially the net effect depends on how much you destroy and how much you create. So it doesn't solve the macroeconomic problem.
Yeah, the macroeconomic problem is really there, you know, and President Xi take the approach that to increase the capacity with this new productive force we mentioned in the beginning. But the thing that, go back, when we see the China's history, the past 40 years, the engine of this economic miracle is because the private sector.
That's right.
Yeah. I once interviewed Warren Buffett a few years ago. He said the Chinese got the secret sauce of success. What's the secret of source of success? It's through the private sector release the huge human potential of Chinese people. But the thing is that now private sector is really in a very depressed situation. But although President Xi, you know, on a few occasions, he said our private sector is very important to us. Just a few days ago, he visited Shandong province. He said our private sector is great, it's very important. But we did not see the jump start of, you know, of private sector. We did not feel the energy, and everyone seems, the private sector people I talked to, very depressed. And also, you know, another element, you know, with this private sector, because the foreign investment. Just in April, President Xi received a group of American executives, and after that, you know, released a 24-point action plan. But seems, you know, not only the private sector did not have jump start, and the foreign company respond to this 24 action, you know, is kind of just so-so. Do not have so much excitement about that. So what's happening? What could be the reason for this lack of significant action?
I've got a simple reason, but it doesn't just go for China. It really transcends China. It goes across the world. It's a trust deficit.
Okay.
And the trust deficit really was caused by COVID. And the trust deficit that China has is both internal with its people and external. And it's very difficult to turn around trust deficits quickly. It has to be consistent, effective action.
Yeah.
And you can't get too pessimistic when initial action fails, because if you go back to the 08 American crisis, a lot of the things we did early didn't work.
Yeah.
But you kept at it, eventually you found the right solution. So I think the trust deficit that exists really is making amelioration very difficult.
As a foreign investor, what exact action do you want to see? What can make you trust the Chinese government again?
You know, I think the key to it all is you have to say what you mean and do what you say. And if you can't do that, just happy words expressed are not going to get you there.
Yeah, so I very much agree with that. If you go back to the history of Chinese reforms, to the early 1980s, Deng Xiaoping, Hu Yaobang, Zhao Ziyang, they delivered what they promised. And they were very careful about wording their policy pronouncements, making sure that the actions that they undertook matched with the words that they expressed. And at that time, China didn't have a lot of FDI, but China was emerging out of the Cultural Revolution, where the trust deficit was massive, right? So there was, destroyed the Chinese economy, destroyed Chinese education and intellectuals, and destroy the confidence on the part of the Chinese peasants. So the reformist leaders thought very hard how to re-energize the energy and the secret sauce that you
Yeah.
were talking about. It's not actually not that secret. It's
Yeah.
just out there in the open. And so, but how to re-energize that, they were very careful about thinking about the incentives. They were actually very good economists, even though none of them, received a Western degree in economics. But they were thinking about incentives. Economic is about incentives,
Yes.
right? Get the incentives right, and other things are also important, but once you get the incentives right, other things become easier. So I do want to comment on this view that somehow technology is the only force that represents productivity. So that's a very engineering view, and I'm teaching at an engineering school, so I understand that view very, very well. But that's actually not the correct view. If you look at Chinese productivity growth, the Chinese productivity growth came from the private sector, came from allocation of assets from the inefficient state-owned enterprises to the efficient private sector. It came from industrialization where millions and hundreds of millions of rural Chinese moved from agriculture to industry. It also came from business innovations, business model innovations, right? So all these things contributed to productivity growth. Technology is one, and for a developing country at the Chinese per capita GDP, in fact, these other sources of productivity contributions are far more important than technology. And to unleash those forces of productivity require reforms.
Yeah, exactly. And here I have the number here. From 1995 to 2013, the total productive rate is 15.5%. But by 2014 to 2018, it's down to only 5.7%. It's like, as we all know what's happening in 2014, right? As you put more emphasis, resource, power into the state enterprise, inevitably, the productive rate, goes down. And also it's, because, why this productivity go down is also because that the same investment cannot produce the same return. But still, China is going on this investment-driven, export-driven economy. So my question here is that why China, what's the rationale behind this? Because most countries, United States, Europe, they do the stimulus package. They hand out money to consumers, to everyone, to household. So what's the rationale, behind this, like as the economy going so low, the domestic demand going so low. Domestic demand right now only count 37% of GDP, significantly lower than the global average. What's rationale behind this policy preference?
When it comes to rationale, I think both of us can't tell you.
We can try. Yeah.
No, so I think we don't know the rationale, we don't know the motivation, but we know the symptoms of the problems.
Yeah.
And there was a very interesting article in Foreign Policy that was published last week. So there was an American researcher who went to China. He talked to many economic analysts in China. And they told him that one possibility is that Xi Jinping doesn't know the Chinese economy is in trouble.
Really?
Well, according to him, I have no idea. So I have to teach, so I didn't go to the Politburo meeting. And so he doesn't know. I mean, think about this, right? Who has the right incentive to tell him, under your leadership, you have all these economic
But he read
challenges?
newspaper,
Well, I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
So that I have no idea. But I do want to add that the income, the lack of demand, typically is viewed as a saving issue. Right? Chinese save at a very high rate. That is true, but that's only 50% of the issue. The other 50% is China has a remarkably low labor income ratio to GDP and declining. Right? So China started out in 1978 around 54% of the GDP as labor income. It rose in the first decade of the reforms to about 61% in 1990. Since then, it has declined tremendously. It has begun to pick up in the recent years, but much of that was driven by the property boom.
Yes.
Right, the property income. And now the property sector is not doing very well, so that source of income generation is going to weaken, and then we're going to have both ratios going in the wrong direction, labor share of the GDP going down, and the savings rate going up, right? So essentially, the capacity, the consumption capacity is reduced both by the labor share of the GDP going down as well as by rising savings. So in terms of the government policy, they should make massive income transfers
Yes.
to the Chinese people. And that transfer has two effects. In the short run, it's going to increase their consumption capacity. In the long run, it is going to alleviate their concerns about future pension expenditures and social security concerns. So it's going to reduce their savings rate, right? And it's also a macroeconomic stimulus policy, but they don't do it.
From what I read, it's like President Xi said, he should encourage people to 吃苦, eat business.
That's exactly the wrong thing to do.
Hand out money to people is just a waste of money.
Well, I think he intended that for the under 25 at least, not the over 25. But, this is musing. It's not knowledge at all, but you begin to think, is it really not the fact that he doesn't know, but that he doesn't want to do? And he doesn't want to do, is it because of philosophy? Kind of his view that income should be much more widely spread. So if you told him real estate crisis, he would say, well, that gets me closer to common prosperity.
Yeah.
From my perspective. Not good for the economy, but from my perspective. However, perhaps the message are changing. So an optimistic note, one, the Panthers are going back to Washington.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Wow, fantastic.
So, is that kind of a signal that, I'm kind of listening? We'll see what comes out of the July plenum. If it goes in a direction of your suggestion, which would be fantastic, because China knows they did it once and it worked during the 08 global crisis.
Yeah.
So they know it works.
Yeah.
So that's why a lot of Western analysts of China have really gotten it wrong for the last few years, because they look at the $3 trillion of reserves and they say, well, he can do it. But what they're missing is, which you're not missing at all, he doesn't want to do it.
Yeah, $1.6 trillion on this.
Yeah,
$1.6 trillion on this new productive force, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So why, we don't know, but
Yeah.
So there are things that I think Chinese government can do that don't cost any money.
Yeah.
Land reforms, 户口reform.
户口 reform.
So
Yes.
there's one estimate that if you reform the 户口 system, by the way, under Hu Jintao, the experiments were carried out in Chengdu to reform the 户口 system, and usually you reform the 户口 system together with the land system. Those two things go with each other. One of the biggest problems in the Chinese economy is that this incredible real estate boom did not benefit the rural Chinese who were on the sell side of the land assets, because the land is owned by the
government.
government And essentially the government got the land from the rural Chinese at very low prices, and then sell the land at very high prices. So the gains of the real estate boom have gone to the government and have gone to the connected real estate developers, and rather than going to the rural Chinese. And rural Chinese, there are two ways to define a rural Chinese in China. One is you define them by their location, where they live. By that definition, today, the Chinese, rural Chinese are about 40% of the population. But if you go by the hukou standard, right, it is 60% of the population. So if between 40 and 60% of the population didn't benefit from this incredible real estate boom,
Yes.
that is going to lower the consumption capacity.
Yeah, sure it is. But right now, there is a historical rescue package to the housing market, And now we see Wanke's, the sales is getting up. It's getting a little bit better. But let's go back a little bit about foreign investment in China, that not only foreign, but private sector. We see that I have a friend who just come back from Beijing. They said right now there's no deals happening, and VC has no exit. So, Isaac, how do you feel the animal spirit there?
I think, how many of you watch hockey? Raise your hand. The American sports of hockey, okay. So you know what a penalty box is. And China now is in a penalty box. And really the reaction is, we've heard you, but show me.
Okay.
And to get out of the penalty box from a foreign investment standpoint, you're going to have to show, and what we have to show is kind of difficult. You have to show that your internal rules are consistent and are applied consistently. I think there China sometimes gets an exaggerated bad name using one transaction. So people are now saying, well, PwC,
Oh yeah, PwC.
they're going to be fined
$1 billion.
170 million.
Yeah, 1 billion yuan.
Yeah, and then you kind of look at the American papers. The Americans say, well, we're going to fine Toronto Dominion Bank $2 billion. So it's kind of a bad name. But
Yeah.
the other things you've got to show are a little more difficult for China. You have to show that you're not going to be overly belligerent on the South China Sea. You have to show that you're not going to be a best pal to Russia, who is in fact threatening Europe, which is a major customer of yours. So the show me is quite a few things. It's not just internal.
Yeah, and also the PwC, I'm glad you mentioned that, that really sent a very chilling message to the foreign companies. It's like how much money they made during the Chinese market. They were fined $138 million.
It does, but I also think on that one, the press is kind of unfair to China because they're saying fining arbitrary, where it's not arbitrary. They really, forgetting the amount, they really did deserve punishment of some sort.
Okay, yeah.
But the show me list is long. It's not just show me that I could trust you internally. It's also show me that I can trust you in the world, because I don't want to have issues with my government.
Yes, yeah. Right now, it's like not only multinational company, but also some international law firm. They are also retreating from Chinese market, from China. And the multinationals have difficulty to recruit foreign nationals to work in China. So it seems legally, morally, and business, business purpose, multinationals really in a very critical juncture in China. So I know Pomo invests so much, billions of dollars in doing U.S.-China business. What's your view on this?
I ceased being at Pomo in 2015, and I'm kind of glad I'm not there now because it'd be a very difficult decision.
Yeah. So so, I will see most of international companies will kind of have a wait and see, or what's the mindset?
The mindset is the penalty box. And if you want to get out of the penalty box, you're going to have to show me.
Yeah.
But show me is not just show me internally. It's show me on a global basis. Because we'll pick on France, if you're a very large French multinational, you're going to be getting pressure from your government endlessly about what you do in China, as long as China is supporting Russia. When you've got the president of France being so bellicose about the Ukraine war, it's not a good place to be bold if you're the CEO of a large French multinational.
So right now, the private sector is depressing, the foreign investment is kind of decreasing, and people are, you wait and see, kind of hesitate to invest in China. And now China, China choose to go to the old model, the investment-driven model. But now the world is different. In the golden age of globalization, China can export things out. But nowadays, the world is so different. Everywhere you go is the protection, we're in the protection age. Now, Washington and the economists in U.S. and EU said that China tried to export its problem away. Is that true? Can they?
Well, in business school, we teach the students to be nice to your customers.
Yes.
Send them Christmas cards and give them cakes when they get married. So China has this interesting combination of antagonizing
your
the
customer.
best customers and then pursuing an economic strategy that will force the country to be more dependent on your customers. So that I don't quite understand. So I understand one of these two things, but putting both of them together, I don't get it, right? So you either attack United States and Western countries, then you should pursue an economic policy that will not force you to depend on their markets, right? And this is what von Otto Bismarck did, the old Germany, the Prussia. He actually launched the Social Security reforms, and he had a bellicose foreign policy, but he made sure that the Germans get the Social Security, get the pensions, and get the protection, and pay them very, very high wages, in part because he wanted to mobilize them for military purposes, but also because he didn't want the country to be dependent on foreign markets. Or you adopted the Deng Xiaoping strategy, which is that, okay, we have an investment-driven strategy. An investment-driven strategy, by definition, is an export-oriented strategy. Then we should have a good relationship with the West.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. And that's what has happened since the 1990s, and China grew tremendously because of that strategy. And so the current policy is the most puzzling one, right? Because it's inconsistent with each other. These two aspects of the policy are inconsistent.
So action and goal are different.
No, just the actions themselves are canceling out each other, right? And so you can talk about Russia. You can increase trade with Russia. 1.7 trillion apparently is the magic number. The GDP of Russia is about 1.7.
Okay.
It's equivalent to Guangdong province.
Yeah.
You can increase the trade to the roof.
But it's still only
1.7.
Yeah.
U.S. market, which is 20 trillion.
Yeah.
You can increase trade with South Africa, with Indonesia, with India, and this whole idea about global South being independent of the rich West.
But
it's
global
just
South
nonsense.
is also complain. Right now, Brazil and India, they also complain about China's exports.
So that's a separate issue, right? So if you look at the global South share of the GDP, yes, it has increased dramatically. Much of that increase was China. It's not because of these other countries, right? So you don't really gain economically by global South strategy, by Belt and Road strategy, by being close to Russia, and you lose the trust on the part of the Western countries, which have been your technology partners, economic partners. They have educated, many of us, right? So it's just puzzling that the country decided to go down that path.
I couldn't agree more. It's very nihilistic at the end of it all. I mean, your customer, even if he's the most benevolent customer, is going to get mad.
Yeah.
With time. And now you've gotten him mad.
Yeah.
To the point that even Europe, which is much less bellicose than the United States, is now mad. I mean, they couch it in a more polite term because they kind of think Americans are savages, but the point is they are getting mad, and the action is not very different than the American action. We were in China a few weeks ago talking to some officials that work in some of the think tanks. And I asked them a question to think about. What I asked them to think about is the following. In terms of corrective action that's needed. I told them that in America today, we are so divided. We can't agree on anything. The only thing the two parties and the population agree is that China is in a penalty box and should be punished. That's the only agreement between Democrats and Republicans. So you've managed to do that. You've done something really wrong. So you need to reflect.
The consequence is obvious. Biden administration just increased tariff on EV and on battery and on many other things still, and the tariff on EV is more than 100%, 103%. So the other day I asked Craig Allen, the president of U.S China Business Council, why 100%? Because there is no EV cars sold in the U.S. yet. So what's the purpose? He said that it's about the long game. It's United States determined to have our own EV industry without just to set up the limit that China's EV cannot come to our market.
He's saving the U.S. auto industry, or at least he wants people to believe that doing this will save the U.S. auto industry. Whether or not it will, I'm not quite sure. But on the point about the long game, I think we have to be realistic about what the U.S. government can do and vis-a-vis what the Chinese government can do. Chinese government can do anything. Nothing will stop them from doing anything. If they can think of something, they can do it. In the U.S., the government cannot really do that much other than tariff policies.
Yeah.
Right? So the tariff policy has an effect of changing relative prices. Essentially, what the tariff policy does is that it raises the prices of the EVs relative to the prices of other traditional cars. In the Biden tariff, purposely excluded traditional cars. So essentially, the traditional car is not protected. You protect the EV and raise the relative prices of EV. These are the few things that the U.S. government can do.
And for this tariff, EV is not that important. Actually, the battery, it hurt Chinese company. Basically, it's kind of close out the U.S. clean energy market to Chinese company. Janet Yellen is also asked EU to increase tariff on Chinese goods. So how will this end? Each way going to the different direction, but these two countries still combined so closely together.
I think the direction we're heading is a direction really of a bipolar world, which is a much more dangerous world than what we saw during the Cold War. Because during the Cold War, if you were a good analyst, certainly if you're a very good economist, you knew that the Soviet Union could not last economically. Sooner or later, it would collapse. Ronald Reagan, through his actions, helped it collapse perhaps faster than it would have. But regardless of what one thinks of the direction of China, it is not going to collapse. It is already a 17 trillion economy. It's got tremendous capacity. Just see where China has gone from 2000 to 2024. So that, combined with Russia, combined with oil from the Middle East, creates an existence that gets the world closer and closer to war. And yesterday was the 80th anniversary of the Normandy invasion.
Yeah.
And I think the world is similar today from a risk standpoint that what you saw during the 1930s. So now, as Mark Twain says, history is never the same, but it rhymes. Well, there's now a rhyme of the 1930s in terms of natural resources, in terms of geopolitical stress. So I don't know how it ends, but that's the worst ending. I think getting along, honest conversations, mutual respect would be a much, much better path to go. One leader seems to be there for a long time. The American leadership will change and likely change again in 2028. So it's not as determinant as the direction as the Chinese leader at the moment.
But Professor, do you think U.S. and China still is capable to have a reasonable trade relations?
Well, I very much agree with the view that the political foundation is not there. Right?
Okay.
So to have a reasonable working relationship requires the political foundation, right? The South China Sea, the Taiwan. The risks that I see in the next 10 years and 15 years are having to do with leadership issues. You know, Xi Jinping, this is third term, so fourth term, fifth term, you know, what is going to happen there? And in a authoritarian system, you always have a problem of how you transfer power from one leader to another, right? So that has, you know, Mao had that problem, Deng Xiaoping had that problem, and many other authoritarian countries have that problem. So that problem is going to come up. Well, you think about this in 10 years' time. You have a leader that is going to deal with domestic economic issues, political issues, and then you have, say, Trump doing whatever he does, and then you have a leader in Taiwan who may be more determined to test the water. That's not a good combination, right? So in addition to these economic issues, there's this geopolitical risks. So I come down to the same view as Isaac, but maybe from a little bit different perspective. You know.
Wow, it seems the worldview is very dark. Let's keep that in mind, but hope for the best. Thank you so much. Let's give our speaker a round of applause.